welcome folks to our June edition of the Local History Guild here at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. My name is Mike Dyer. I'm the Curator of Maritime History, and we have a couple of illustrious guests with us this evening. One of whom is present, and the other of whom is striving to be present. And we hope that he will be present with us shortly. But the man who is with us is John Bullard, probably known to everyone. He was ex former mayor of the city of New Bedford, and let's see, what else were you, John? You were also the former director of NOAA Fisheries in New England, right?
Well, I still am the former mayor and still am the former head of fisheries. You don't retire the former title.
That's right. So you're still the former. But I took the liberty of sort of poking around a little bit with the Bullards, and John Morgan Bullard was your grandfather?
Correct. Yeah.
So John Morgan Bullard he has quite the impressive list of books that he wrote. He wrote The Greens as I Knew Them, The Roaches, Friends Academy, 1810 to 1860, A History of the First 150 Years, Joseph Roach in Nantucket and Dartmouth, and he edited Edmund Gardner's biography. Yeah,
he every time he had a heart attack, he wrote a book in recovery, and he had a lot of heart attacks, so he wrote a lot of books.
So yeah. John Morgan Bullard, he was a lawyer associated with Crapo, Clifford, Prescott, and Bullard.
Yeah.
And I guess he represented the Greens, Edward H. Green and Hetty Green. Is that right?
Yeah. He didn't like the day they shook the plum tree, which was about Hetty Green, and having represented her, he said that's not an accurate representation of Hetty Green, so he wrote The Greens as I Knew Them to get that. And while I didn't really like my grandfather all that much, I did respect that he put words on paper. And as you know, Mike, as a historian, that's what it's about, how you get facts down on paper for future generations to be able to benefit. And I did respect that about my grandfather. And so that's one of the inspirations for Hometown, the book that I wrote, was to get from my memories what I remember about certain things, and get them down on paper so that while I could still remember them.
Right.
So
well, I mean, the Roach. This is absolute classic stuff. This is mainstream reference. I keep it right here, at my desk. This, that's like when you say putting words down on paper, the compilation, The Roaches, is pretty much indispensable. And I think it's indispensable history. This book isn't indispensable history yet. It's going to be indispensable history in years to come. These are, very, very different types of books. This is John Bullard's. This is a primary source. So this is, primary sources aren't history. Primary sources are primary sources. And then like, somebody like Judy Lund or me or any number of, historians are going to come along, in the next 40 or 50 years. And this is going to sit on the shelf, right there next to, Daniel Ricketson's History of New Bedford and the Roaches and these other basic, basic texts that you use to interpret and understand the past. And, what I was most impressed by, John, as I'm reading this, of course, we had Ken Hartnett's the other guy who's going to be on this webinar here by and by, if he can get signed up and get on, which we all keep your fingers crossed that we can, because Ken's a great guy and he has tons to say. But the thing is that Ken Hartnett wrote the he wrote the intro to this book, the foreword by Ken Hartnett, and it really does put it in time and place, from the point of view of a major journalist in 20th century New Bedford, talking about a major figure in the shaping of the community as we know it today, John Bullard. And so, what about that, John? I mean, keep in mind that I didn't really even turn up here. We didn't move down here until 2001. We moved down from the Kendall whaling, from up in Sharon, and so I wasn't really deeply involved in New Bedford proper until the early 2000s, so the 21st century. And so the city that I know, you largely made, at least according to the book. Is that right?
Well, no, I mean, I played a role in a lot of things. And one of the points I try to make is that no achievement is done by one person. And I wanted to make sure that a lot of people who played a hand in things, the saving of the Zeiterion or the fixing up of the Waterfront Historic District, that their stories would be told. And unlike the books you've written, Mike, mine is not a footnoted history. Mine is the memories of a grandfather. And I remember seeing Donald Gomes, who has played many roles in New Bedford, but in the Waterfront Historic District, he served as the chair of the Zoning Board of Appeals. And so I would appear before Donald a lot because we did an awful lot through zoning variances. And I saw Donald at a wake because he was working at funeral parlors. And I said, Donald, I'm writing about you right now. And I explained this is a book from memory, not footnotes. And he said to me, well, John, just you realize that your memory of something may be different than my memory of the same thing.
Well, there you go.
And I use that right in the preface. I think that is very, very true. And I did have the advantage when I was mayor from 86 to 92 that my staff kept a scrapbook of news clippings. And so I could go back and look through how the newspaper covered certain events that I wanted to cover. And I could compare my vivid memories of things with what the newspaper said happened. And I could sometimes see, ooh, my memory of something is very vivid, but it doesn't comport with what the newspaper said happened.
What do you think about that? Do you think that that's your memory, or is that?
No, I think that your memory can be very strong, but wrong. And
what about the reporting? Is the reporting always right?
I think I hear a lot of people say, and there's a section on this, I do a section on the press because I've been covered by the press and my jobs a lot. I hear people say, oh, I was misquoted. And I find that I can't think of a time I've been misquoted. I think reporters, and a lot of them now, have recordings.
Reporters, yeah, sure.
Yeah. I think reporters, by and large, and I wish Ken were here, do a very good job. I think what frequently happens is a person will say something to a reporter, and then the next day they read about it in the press and they say, oh, I wish I hadn't said that. And someone calls them on it and they say, I was misquoted. No, they weren't misquoted. They just don't like what they said in the heat of the moment.
That's perfectly, yep, I can understand that. we should point out that this is published, that Spinners published this.
Yes.
It's published locally.
Spinner is, I've been working with Joe Thomas at Spinner for, I don't know, 40 years or so. And they, like the Whaling Museum, do a great job in what we've been talking about, getting local history down on paper. And once it's down on paper, it's there, as you just held up, Daniel Ricketson, Zephaniah Pease, you know, my grandfather, people who have put it down on paper, where future historians, Mike, at the book launch, I mentioned that when I was a high school student, a teacher of mine says, why don't you do a paper on the Great Stone Fleet? And I came to the Whaling Museum, and Philip Purrington was the curator. And he took me down into the library and took the logbooks from the Great Stone Fleet and blew the dust off them and opened up the logbooks from the captains. And imagine, you know, a teenager reading and adjusting, you know this, I don't know how many thousands of logbooks you've read, but adjusting your eyesight to the handwriting of the captains and transporting yourself in time back, literally, this was 1965 or so, back 100 years, almost exactly, to these captains taking these whale ships bought by the federal government, loaded with stone, to implement President Lincoln's Civil War strategy of blockading Charleston and Savannah by sinking vessels. A spectacular failure, by the way, because they sunk into the mud and kept sinking. So the blockade was not successful, but it was my first foray into original research. No one had read these logbooks in 100 years. I was the next person to open them since those captains closed the book. And it was so exciting to me. My God, this is history. I've just gone back 100 years. I'm reading what these captains put down with their own hand.
Hey,
How
look,
exciting is that?
preaching to the choir, mate. That's why
I
I come to
know.
work every day.
I know. It was so great. I mean, I fell in love with history that moment as a teenager because of what your institution, the Whaling Museum, has on its shelves.
It's pretty easy to, well, a couple points there. I mean, it's easy to fall in love with history in this region. So, you know, the places, you just take Fish Island, for instance, just chatting here.
I don't think I could. I think somebody owns that. I don't think they'd like me to take it.
But, you go by there today and there's a
joking.
bunch of cranes over there,
Yeah.
and there's some fishing boats that are tied up there, and there's constantly work going on. But, that has been the center, like the center of
Right.
American maritime culture since, the 1770s.
Yeah.
I mean, earlier, maybe the 1760s.
Right.
Even. I mean, that's like right in the middle of one of the great harbors on the East Coast.
Yeah.
And when you look at everything that's going on there, from what was it, Weston Howland and his oil refinery to Nye Oil and those great big built stone buildings there that they were making pilot whales, boiling them down and making a fine lubricant out of them. And that's just that one place, and right outside my office here is the corner of Union and Water. That's the old Four Corners. We're in History Central, but more to the point is the people here are passionate about this stuff. There's a core of people in the region who are very, very interested in their history and take it very, very seriously. So I think that's a really curious thing. I think to experience.
Well, I mentioned, I remember listening to a talk by Richard Kugler about my ancestor, Joseph Roach, who, about the time you're talking about, 1765, comes from Nantucket and buys 10 acres and brings his whaling industry from Nantucket to New Bedford. And at the same time, he is competing with John Hancock, among others, for supremacy in the whale fishery in an international way. And John Hancock has a philosophy of horizontal integration. That is, he wants to have a monopoly on whale oil, like the Hunts in silver, a couple of decades ago. And
there's Ken.
How you doing? Can everybody hear me?
Hey,
yes,
Ken.
we can.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. You're here.
Good to see you.
And
I'm sorry it took so long.
that's all right. You're here. I'm just telling a story on Joseph Roach. And Joseph Roach has a directly opposed philosophy, business philosophy, vertical integration, which is, I want to have a piece of every part of the business. I want to build the ships, outfit the ships, insure the ships, sail the ships, catch the whales, process the whale products, market them all over. And so you have these two titans going head to head. And in Kugler's talk, he describes about someone saying to Hancock, you paid a lot of money for the whale oil. And he says, it doesn't matter. I own it all. I'm going to sell it in London, make a lot of money. And he goes over there. He doesn't account for the fact that Roach is a pretty smart guy, has stockpiled a whole bunch of whale oil in France, dumps it on the market before Hancock gets there, and drives Hancock out of business, which is probably good for America because he had—
That was all she wrote. I mean, that worked.
Yeah, it worked. And so these guys, these whalers, were smart, international businessmen, and their footprint was huge. And, Laura and I just went to the Galapagos Islands in March, and you mentioned the Gardner Journal. Gardner was a guy from Nantucket who moved to New Bedford, lived to be 90, but his he was an interesting guy. I mean, first of all, his boat was sunk by a whale in the Atlantic, and he and his crew rowed 900 miles. No loss of life to the Azores. And then 5 years later, he's chewed up by a whale, crushed skull, pierced tongue, broken shoulder, mangled hand. And he ends up in a town in Peru where they want to give him last rites, convert him to Catholicism. And he says, no, take me to another 200 miles to this doctor. And the rest of you guys go back out whaling, come back in 6 months, I'll be okay. And you wonder, he's 23 years old. How does he even know there's a doctor? He didn't know he's going to get chewed up by a whale. And I'm rereading the thing because I'm going to Galapagos. And I said, if he's off Peru, he must have known about Galapagos. So it turns out he went to Galapagos in 1811. That's 25 years before Darwin. And is in that journal you mentioned, there's a whole page and a half of him observing the tortoises to try and figure out whether they're warm-blooded or cold-blooded. He was the first whaler in Hawaii. These guys, they not only had to know where all the whales were in the ocean, they had to know where all the support systems were on every piece of land that they might end up with, like a doctor someplace in Peru. Their knowledge was encyclopedic, and I don't think they had Google back then either.
And the scary bit is, the funny bit is, the interesting bit is that you can walk right out here on the corner of Water and Union, and you could stand right there. Edmund Gardner stood there, so did William Roach, so did William Roach Jr., so did George Howland, You know, so did Mayor Ashley, so did John Bullard, you know, I mean, it's like.
Paul Cuffey had a store
Paul
there, right?
Cuffey, you know,
Yeah.
So Ken, what do you think about this book?
You asking me what I think about John's book?
Yeah, what do you think about this book? You wrote the intro to it. What's the story there?
Well, I think the book is basically as John Bullard is the book. Is the book is John Bullard. John Bullard is the book. It's his life. It's his experience. What I have never been able to figure out is how he has so much memory for detail in that book. I mean, he really knows all the people who helped him on this thing and what they did and what they said so many years ago, and it's just amazing. I mean, I would suspect he has some kind of a diary, but he says no. Maybe Laurie kept good scrapbooks. I don't know that either.
How does it jive with your own memories?
What's that?
How
Well,
does
I
it jive
came
with your
here in
own memories?
'95, so that was after John. After John had left the office, he was with the OSHA at that time. So
Noah, not OSHA. Noah.
Noah, yes.
The National Organization for the Advancement of Acronyms. No, that's not it.
That's the other one.
Yeah. Okay. But it was
One of those federal government
he
agencies.
was
One of
not
them.
were you in Washington then, John, when I arrived in '85?
Yeah, I was in Washington in the 90s. Yeah.
So he came late to his own house, you know, in terms of meeting me. About early '97, we probably met. '97, '98, he came home for the holidays or something. But it's yeah, I think the book is a great fun to read, and it's just takes in an awful lot of change.
Hey,
And
Ken, can you journalists be trusted?
can we journalists be trusted?
Yeah.
I think so. I think we're fallible as human beings, but I think we all try to pursue the truth.
Probably more than people who work for the government.
Because we were just opening the chat when we were talking a bit about, you know, John was saying that you know, that he was having a conversation with the Mr. Gomes, and Gomes said he may remember things differently from the way John remembers them, and John seemed to think that he had a very sharp memory and that he would have to go back and take a look at the newspapers and read, you know, some of the news, some of the journalism that came out of these experiences in his, you know, in his time, you know, in office and whatnot, and it was a very useful reference to his own memory. And we just sort of got, you know, talking about what is the place of journalism in memory, and its reliability, and you know, and you know, as an editor of the newspaper, you know, I'm sure that, you know, these two things, they mesh closely. I think
here's the difference
in a book like this.
Here's the difference between the old and the new journalism. I think before, when you had a story and you were writing it, you put it in perspective with the past. Now, if you were new to the city, you didn't know all the past, so you would look in the morgue for what is that built on the story you're writing now. So you have the background. Now I don't think they have a very much of a morgue system. They have electronic things. The bigger papers have sophisticated ones, but a Standard Times editor today would look for clips. There are no clips. They got rid of them all. They threw out their history. So they have new reporters coming into the city who don't know squat about the city, and they have no way to find out unless they talk to other, whatever kind of old journalists there are around, and there aren't too many around because they're all been laid off long ago, most of them. So it's a very tough time for journalism now. But that was a pretty rich experience. And you could, unless you were very, very lazy, if you didn't check the morgue, you were very lazy, and you had a skimpy story because you had no recollection of the past.
Well,
What do you
Mike,
think, John?
I'll give you an example of my memory and checking it with the newspaper. In my final campaign, which was against Rosemary Tierney, I had to make a decision on where to site the sewer treatment plant. And there were two prime areas. One was called Standard Times Field, which was located a vacant piece of land just inside the hurricane barrier. And the other was where the primary plant was, which was at Fort Rodman. And it was a close decision in my mind. I mean, there were 44 places we looked, but it boiled down to those two. And the people in the South End did not want the plant at Fort Rodman because no one I've ever met wants to live next to a sewer treatment plant. Maybe someone will raise their hand and say, I do, but I've never run into someone. And so I had always gotten 2/3 of the vote in the South End. And when I decided to locate the plant where the old plant was, the people in the South End had an amazing shift of opinion about my suitability for office. And I said, well, the Standard Times Field is privately owned. At some point, it will create jobs for New Bedford. And the South End, where the old plant is publicly owned, and it should be fixed up. We should fix up Fort Tabor. We should create a park, and we're never going to be able to do that unless we also put the sewer plant there. So that's why I'm going to put the plant there. And Rosemary Tierney, in my opinion, ran against me with, if I win, I am going to move the plant to Standard Times Field. And she won the election by 392 votes, very close election. By the way, there was a 72% voter turnout. Nowadays, it's 16%. Then it was 72%. And she won those two precincts at Fort Rodman by 680 votes. So more than double her overall was that. So I was convinced that the whole race boiled down to her saying she was going to move the location. And when I briefed her right after the election on all of the issues of the sewer plant, she said, John, I'm not moving the plant. It's going to be right where you said it was. I said to myself, I can't believe she sold out the voters like 1 week after the election, but that's what she did. And then I go and I look at the scrapbook of Standard Times for the whole election. And I look at the one debate we had. I look at all her ads. I look at all the stories of the campaign. Nowhere in any ads she did, nowhere in the coverage of the one debate we had, could I find that she said she was going to move the plant. And yet I had two things. I had this indelible impression that the whole campaign was her saying she was going to move the plant. And the analysis of the election by the Standard Times after I lost was that I lost because of the sewer plant. So I'm saying this is fascinating because I was absolutely convinced the issue was the sewer plant, yet I couldn't find any proof in the paper. So that's what I'm saying, that memory can be a funny thing. It can be vivid, but it can play tricks on you.
Yeah, well, Boston had an election, with Louise Day Hicks, and she ran. She never said she was against busing. She said you know where I stand. That was her line. You know where I
Yeah.
stand. And
One final thing, on the
so
Standard Time
Rosemary may
Field,
have done a variation of that.
Yeah.
You know where I stand on the shore plant.
the Standard Times Field is where offshore wind is taking place. So if I put the sewer plant there, there would be no offshore wind today. No one would be
That's
talking about
foresight,
that.
John. That's foresight.
Yeah.
But it is funny. Memory is a funny thing, you know, and you find yourself confronting with, I know this happened, but you can't find proof of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
The book is very interesting. I mean, you go into actual conversations, you know, that you had with people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is kind of extraordinary. I mean, for a book of this type, you know, you don't really, few people can actually remember conversations that they had, but you know, it's pretty interesting that way. And you know, I also like the sort of way you break it down into these important events, like, you know, like the Ernestina, like, you know, Coalition for Buzzards Bay, like the sewage treatment plant, you know, these chunks of stories, and you know, I should ask you, that electric power plant that was just knocked down,
Yeah.
was that ever, where was that on your radar screen?
I don't think, I mean, really, that wasn't something I ever got that involved in as mayor. I don't think that was a part of the waterfront that I dealt with. It was after I was mayor that some folks wanted to turn it into a huge aquarium, an effort that ultimately didn't work out. It was a power plant when I was mayor.
Oh, okay.
And, you know, it wasn't something that a use that we were trying to change or anything, because it was working as a power plant at that time. It wasn't by any way the biggest polluting problem. The PCBs in the North End and Cornell Dubelier were starting to be recognized as the huge problem. Mike DeLand, who became a very good friend of mine and who I was dealing with the violation of the Clean Water Act and the new treatment plant, was also saying, we've got to do something on the PCBs. And their first plan was to remove them and incinerate them. And no one at the time was objecting to that plan. And there are all kinds of political lessons, which one from that is, just because people don't object to something the first time you say it doesn't mean there isn't opposition. It just means that they're not going to tell you they're opposed the first time you say it. They may wait until you spend an awful lot of money developing plans, and then after you think you're in the clear, then they're going to raise up and say, this is an idiotic idea, and you're going to have to back up and develop different plans. That's what happened with the PCBs.
John, getting back quickly to the sewage issue. You lost your first election because of the sewage issue.
Oh, yeah.
Not the water treatment plant, but the sewage fee.
Sewer fee.
Yeah, and you would think that would have given you a little bit of a heads up going into the issue on the location of that plant to the south end.
Well, it was both regarding sewage, but different sides of the issue. Hold on a sec here.
I think I distracted.
Yeah. So I think the sewer, but one of the things it did, and just to tell a little bit of that story, in the first election in '83, you know, Mayor Markey had become a judge. He'd been mayor for 11 years, so there was pent-up demand. 19 people ran for mayor. And I won the preliminary by a comfortable margin. And there's 4 weeks before the final. And, you know, the issues are what you'd expect in New Bedford, you know, drugs, economy, affordable housing. And then out of nowhere, a reporter says at a press conference, should there be a sewer fee in New Bedford? And my campaign staff in the room all go like this, which I think is body language for do not touch that question unless the bomb disposal unit gets here before you answer it, because that question is nothing but trouble. And, you know, this is why no one should ever work for me in campaigns, because I do not take instruction well. And so I look at the reporter and say, sewer fees are federal law. We are part of the United States. Yes, there should be a sewer fee in New Bedford. And Brian Lawler, who I'm running against, said, oh, wow, it's Christmas, New Year's, Easter, all in one, Valentine's Day. John Bullard just gave me the gift that keeps on giving. And he holds a press conference saying, if I'm elected mayor, there won't be a sewer fee in New Bedford. And the last 3 weeks of the campaign, no one talks about the economy. No one talks about housing. No one talks about crime in the streets. All they talk about is the sewer fee. And experts come from Washington. They come from Boston. They say, yes, you got to have a sewer fee. No, you don't have to have a sewer fee. And on election day, voters go into the booth saying, I don't know what the hell to believe. All I know is if I vote for Bullard, I'm getting a sewer fee. And if I vote for Lawler, I'm not. And he wins by a very comfortable margin. And then he finds out, oh, it is federal law. I got to put in a sewer fee. So he puts in the sewer fee, and 2.5 years later, because it's a special election, I go knocking on doors and people say, oh, you're the guy who told us the truth. We'll vote for you this time. So, I mean, Lawler had some other problems, you know, because he, as he said, well, yeah, just because everyone around me is a crook, but I'm an honest guy. But at any rate, that was the sewer fee issue.
I really like the way you described in the book about how politicians will very often recognize that there's a problem and do absolutely nothing about it.
Yeah, Nimtoff.
That they'll say, yes, there's a problem. Somebody needs to do something about it, but it's not going to be me.
But yeah, I said everyone knows what NIMBY is, not in my backyard, but more powerful than NIMBY is Nimtoff, which is not in my term of office.
Right.
Yeah, we have to solve the Social Security problem or the debt ceiling, just not before the next election. Yeah, after the next election. Just let me get through this election, and then I will figure out how we make Social Security solvent. Just after the next election, Nimtoff.
The whole society operates on that principle too.
Absolutely. And the other thing I learned my first week in office.
Short term, we're all dead. You know, the long term, hey.
Say that again, Ken?
The long term, we're all dead. The short term is what we have to deal with. And
right.
We'll be dead politically if we deal with the short term.
But I think we've got a whole bunch of people here. I bet they have a lot of questions. So maybe we should see if some people who are listening in have questions.
Now's your chance, folks, to plumb the depths of the minds of these two sharp fellas. And in the meantime, I got to tell you, as one who uses books, I think the index is really great.
Yeah, that is Joe Thomas. He spent a lot of time on this index.
It really shows, and it's very useful, because what happened was you sent me a PDF of this, and then it was after my lunch today. I ran down to the store. I was like, oh, I should get a hard copy so I can wave it around. tonight, show people that this
Yeah.
book actually exists. And they didn't have a copy. And then I was gonna call up to the Free Public Library, and see if they had a copy. I went over to Amanda McMullen. I thought maybe she had a copy, but she didn't have a copy. So I called Jay up at Spinners, and he's like, "Yeah, come on up." And I said, "What? You're going to sell me a book?" He's, "No, I'll just give it to you. You can just take it." And so I brought it back, and I spent the afternoon, you going through the index and highlighting stuff that that I wanted to read about. And I read some good stuff about Buzzards Bay, good stuff about sewage, good stuff about your political philosophy. And I didn't read the fly fishing section, but I should read that.
Well, I'll tell you, you'll be surprised, Mike, but there's a story around that too. There's stories everywhere. And that is, we planned the book launch for June 1st, and we set the date probably sometime in April or May. And we had a printer that Joe had used for over 10 years and worked with the Whaling Museum. And I'm not just blowing smoke. The Whaling Museum was a pleasure to work with. And then 10 days before the book launch, Joe tells me that the printer told him, "Oh, the books aren't going to be ready." And I said, "What?" Only I said, "What?" at a greatly increased volume from what I just said of that. And I thought about it overnight, and I said, "We're not changing the book launch because people are coming from great distances, and we've got caterers and everything else." So I said, "Joe, we have to have something for people who've bought the book. I don't care if you have to mimeograph 300 copies and staple them together. We're going to have something." And so Joe, to his great credit, found a different printer and basically did a paperback, which is what you're holding up.
Right.
This copy, and printed 300 paperbacks.
These are going to be valuable. Something. This is going to be the first
Yeah,
edition.
this is and I said, "You better call it give it a cool name." So what you're holding is one of 300 advanced reader copies, which will probably sell on eBay for more than the cost of the hardcovers. And so anyone who bought the book, including right now, gets for free an advanced reader copy, which is the complete book. It's just a paperback. The paper's a little thinner. It's not coated, but it's the whole book. And so Joe really, to his credit, scrambled when the printer, who I don't know how to do Yelp or whatever those reviews are, but when I'm going to learn so I can give the printer the kind of review that I want to give for.
Hey, our programs director, Beatrice Oliveira, says, "Great talk. Thanks. Where can we get the hard copy once it's available?"
Yeah. So there are several answers to that question. You can get it directly from Spinner. So go into the Spinner website. You'll be able to get it at the Whaling Museum bookstore or Barnes and Noble, or across the street at Drawing Room, or all the local bookstores in the area. Of course, you can get it from Amazon, but Amazon is not a good way to support local bookstores. So I'd encourage you you can go to Spinner right now and order it. But we're told now it'll be available at the end of the month. But you can order it now, and it'll get shipped to you.
So thanks for that. Vanessa Gralton wants to know, and you probably both of y'all can weigh in on this one. What are your thoughts on gentrification of New Bedford? I'm curious, is there such a thing?
Yeah.
And is it going to happen? Is it happening now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, when I was mayor, I never would have envisioned that as a problem. The houses in my neighborhood, when I got out of graduate school, living, across the street from Ken, we're all selling for $20,000. And I just couldn't dream of gentrification being a problem. It is a problem. And the answer to the problem, in my opinion, is you have to increase supply. And any way that we can create more housing of every kind to increase supply. And I agree with the mayor on this. That is not just a New Bedford problem. That has to be something that all the surrounding towns do as well. Affordable housing occurs in New Bedford, but it needs to occur more. I now live with Lori in Westport. It has to be built in the Westports and Marions and Dartmouths. When you look at the percentage of affordable housing in New Bedford, and then you contrast that with the percentage of affordable housing in the suburbs, the contrast is stark. And so it needs to be built everywhere. And so that is an issue. When I chaired the commuter rail task force, which I did for 10 years, to prepare for the train, working with SERPED, the Southeastern Regional Economic Development District, we recognize that that's about 40 towns in southeastern Massachusetts, that our area of southeastern Massachusetts is the fastest growing area before the train gets here. So we don't need the train to be to have people move into our area. It's happening before the train, and that I mean, this is a lovely area, and that growth is causing economic pressure, and like a lot of things, that causes pain, which is not fairly distributed. And so, yes, in answer to your question, it's a real issue. And I think the primary solution is we need to increase housing supply. When you look at the story in New Bedford, I don't know where I read it, Keohane, I think, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name, taking the old Merchants Bank, building housing. You look at John Cruz, who is a great minority developer who did Verdian Gardens, who is taking the old Holy Family and building it. I remember John Cruz, the father, he was always the last guy out of the dance floor. Somebody asked me, well, he's a Boston developer. Well, maybe he's a Boston developer, but he has deep roots in the South Central section of our city. And he was, even when he was late 70s, 80 years old, you couldn't get him off the dance floor at the band club in South Central part of New Bedford. He's a wonderful man with deep roots in our city, and he's developing housing in our city. That's what we need, is housing by good local folks.
Hey, John, what do you think about, what do you guys think, John and Ken, what do you think about wind power? Janet Hadley is asked to tell us some of your thoughts on wind power impact on sea life, longevity of equipment, disrupted visual horizons, etc.
You want to go first, Ken?
Sure. I think wind power is a gamble. It's a very big gamble, and I have yet to see strong evidence to say this is going to really work, because it's working with enormous subsidies in Europe. I don't know if it's I don't know, I haven't seen a report on anybody in one of those Scottish cities who have actually been promised some of the things that New Bedford has been promised. But just how many of the profits from the thing are coming to the people on the land, the people who are promised jobs in their communities, are they getting them? Will that happen here? Will we get the workforce? I don't know. Will it be feasible for the stockholders even to walk away with a lot of money? Would the lenders walk away with a lot of money? I don't know that yet. I haven't seen enough. The problem is it's not transparent enough. We haven't seen enough of the facts that support this project. We see a lot of the hopes and dreams, and it may well come true. I hope it comes true, but I'm not sure. It's problematic, yes.
You think it's a gamble, huh?
I think it's a really big gamble. It may pay off. Whaling may have been a big gamble back in the day, but this is a gamble as well. But John may disagree with that. I'm sure he does.
We had Wampanoag boat steerers. There was no gambling.
Yeah, so I think I'm chair of the board of the New Bedford Ocean Cluster, and we support commercial fishing and processing, aquaculture, offshore wind, and marine technology, and believe when the mayor asked me to head up that organization, I said I'm interested in all four of those, but I'm very interested in the intersection of pick any two. I think they can coexist. And I think the question of is whaling a gamble? Boy, I can't think of anything that's more of a gamble than sending a whale ship out for 4 or 5 years around the world, where it represents unlimited liability for the 4 or 5 years it's out at sea.
Yeah.
Or, when the dead whale or a stove boat inscription on the back of the, when you're about to launch that harpoon. All of that has been a gamble. It transformed the city of New Bedford because people were willing to take that gamble. I think that, and when Ken talks about transparency, I think of the surf clam and ocean quahog business, which has, some of the biggest ships in New Bedford. And I remember, I spent a time as the chief regulator of fisheries from Canada to North Carolina. And the surf clam ocean quahog business is a very sustainable business. They harvest about 1/3 of their quota. But the one thing they are not is transparent. I used to say to them in public meetings, I say, if you guys tell me today is Tuesday, the one thing I'm pretty sure is it's any day but Tuesday. I mean, they are just not transparent. They run a good business, sustainable. I eat chowder and all that. They're good for the New Bedford waterfront, but the last thing they are is transparent. And so I think there are a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that we treat different businesses with kind of equal footing. And the second is there's no such thing as the status quo. That is, the ocean environment is changing, and climate change is not a friend of anyone's. It's not a friend of the fishing industry for certain. And we have to get off fossil fuels quickly. It's a state of emergency. Ocean acidification, especially if you're in the scallop industry, or if you look at the base of the food chain, pteropods, things like that, we really need to realize, 400 parts per million CO2 is not something we've had in a million years. So you can't look at wind turbines and measure it against some kind of status quo, because we're not in a status quo situation.
That gets to John Ricketson's question here. He says, is New Bedford planning adequately in meeting the challenge of climate change? So that, I mean, that gets straight down the pike to that question.
Yeah, because I think, and that is related to that, because I think New Bedford has a very good resilience team. I think there are two cities on the East Coast with hurricane barriers, for example, New Bedford and Providence. All New Bedford has to think about doing is, how do we increase the height of our hurricane barrier? Every other city has to figure out, how do I build one? I'm looking at you, Boston, right, where they're investing billions and billions of dollars in the Seaport district. And you know, Mike, because you were interviewed by David Abel, a filmmaker, who's saying, why are we investing billions of dollars in the Seaport district? It's all going to be underwater. So, and New Bedford is also supporting a major clean source of energy, i.e. wind turbines. So I think New Bedford does have a very good resilience plan. By the way, we are partnering with our island community, Nantucket, which is sending over students and faculty, courtesy of Envision Resilience, which has been operating for 3 years in Nantucket. The first year they looked at resilience in Nantucket. Last year they looked at 4 towns in Rhode Island. This year they are looking at New Bedford and Fairhaven. And I always think it's eye-opening when you bring in faculty members and students, college students, because it gets you to think outside the box. Maybe the solutions are sometimes not practical, but it gets you to widen your horizon. So I think that you know, everyone can always be better, but I think under Mayor Mitchell, who chairs the Energy and Environment Committee, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, I think we're, you know, who's planted 4,000 trees, and not 400 trees, not 40 trees, 4,000 trees in his time in office. I think New Bedford does a pretty good job.
Would you agree, Ken?
Do I agree with that?
Would you agree?
I'm sorry.
Would you agree?
Oh, that's what I thought you said. Well, yes and no. I mean, the tree planting thing is an example of transparency in the city. You know, in the old days when there was a city hall reporter going every day, knocking on doors in all of the offices, you'd get some data about what was going on in the city. And we talked before about gentrification. You know, you'd like to know just how rapid this is going. You'd like to know the statistics of it, but you don't get any of that kind of information coming out of City Hall anymore. You don't get the stuff you're talking about with wind coming out of City Hall. You get press releases, but you don't get data. Why are so many investors walking away from this? I don't know. Who are the investors we have here? Who are they really? Do we really know that? We know the names of some of the companies, but who are these people? You know, there's an awful lot that has to be revealed, and that's
who's asking these tough questions then, Ken? Who's asking the tough questions?
New Bedford Light.
New Bedford's Light.
Well,
Thanks to Ken. Thanks to Ken Hartnett, New Bedford Light.
But the Bedford Light has to keep growing. It's very important it grows. It builds its base. It's great, doing great for a startup, but it's gotta move.
Well, looks like we have one last question from John Ricketson, and this is this is a straight down the pike, great question for you, John. Can you talk about a little bit about your experience with whale, its origins, and where does it sit? Where does whale sit as far as the future development of of the region goes. And keep in mind, we're after our hour. So, maybe
Yeah.
5 minutes would be great.
Yeah, well, whale, when I started, I was working with Whale, the Whaling Museum, and the Bedford Landing Taxpayers Association. And it was a good partnership because all three organizations did different things. And Whale, because of the existence of the Whaling Museum, didn't have to be around forever. The Whaling Museum does. So Whale could save buildings, which is always risky business. You have to go out on a limb to save things like the Zeiterion or other buildings. And so that's what Whale has always done very, very well. And Sarah Delano and other leaders of Whale said, if we take those risks and go out and save the buildings that really define New Bedford. I think there's a book, Not Just Anywhere. Without those buildings, we're just anywhere. And we have neighborhoods, thousands of buildings, the North End, South Central, you name it, the West End, that define us. All the mills, for example. I mean, so many, the heritage of New Bedford. If we save those, I learned at Whale that revitalization can be just as contagious as blight, because one person sees a building get fixed up and they say, wow, I want to do that too. And so Whale sets a standard by taking key buildings and fixing it up, and that leads to another one. So they're in a leadership transition right now. Terry Bernard, who did a great job for, 10 years or so, has gone on to another chapter. Rebecca Barnes is in there in an acting capacity while the board of Whale does a job search. But I think, people should be members of Whale because New Bedford is defined in some ways by the built heritage. It's very hard to build a new building that captures the workmanship, the building materials, and the character that you can find on any of 300 streets in New Bedford. And it's so much easier, this, Mike, to fix up an old building than it is to build a new building that isn't going to have the workmanship or the character or give the pleasure of just living in it that New Bedford's building stock does. And that's what Whale does.
Well, gentlemen, I think that we have we're 5 minutes past our hour. So we've given people 5 minutes more than their money's worth. So that's pretty good. You got a bargain.
Oh, good. Hometown.
And you can get Hometown. When did you say the hardcovers were going to be out?
The hardcovers, we're told, will be here at the end of this month. So if you order now,
so July,
you'll get it.
4th of July celebration. Y'all can sit down with your barbecue and your fireworks and read Hometown over the weekend. It's going to be lots and lots of fun.
Thank you, Mike, for this
You're
opportunity.
very welcome. John and Ken, thank you
Mike.
both very much for coming. Carissa Walker and Beatrice Oliveira, thank you very much for your good job setting everything up and good technical support. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. And let's see, this is June, July. I know that in August we're redoing we're at part 2 of this of the New Bedford, Buzzards Bay, Cape and Islands steamship history.
Cool.
So the steamboat companies, the railroad, we're going to be doing part 2 of that. That's coming up in August. So I'm not sure what the July program is, but keep your eye peeled on social media, and we'll see you this time next month or the month after. So thank you all very much. And we're just gotta, it's that awkward Zoom thing where you have to hit the button and everybody says goodbye.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night now.